Hello, I'm Jasmine Tabibi, Research Associate at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to our webinar on Colonialism and Survivance, Unique Experiences of Multigenerational Violence and Cultural Strengths Among Indigenous Peoples in Canada. I want to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewak, and Chinongton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We're so happy today to be joined by Dr. Amy Bombay. Amy Bombay is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry in the School of Nursing at Dalhousie University. Amy is Anishinaabe from Rainy River First Nations and completed her master's and PhD in psychology neuroscience. Her research explores the different pathways by which Indian residential school experiences are transmitted across generations and has garnered extensive media interest and has been influential in influencing policy and practice related to Indigenous health. You can learn more about Amy on our website. I will pass it over to you, Amy, to start the webinar.
Thank you so much for that lovely opening and for the invitation. My name is Amy Bombay. As mentioned, my family's from Rainy River First Nations on my father's side, and on my mom's side is of settler ancestry. And a lot of my research comes from my own personal family, community, and kind of collective experience. This is my picture of my family, my grandparents on my father's side, and we were affected by residential schools and the child welfare system. And so that's really what led me to this research and that I'll be talking about today. Oh, I don't seem to be able to go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. And I'm seeing the slides in French, which unfortunately...
Amy, if you go to the top of your screen where it says View Options.
Okay.
And that says Shared Screens, you should be able to see something that says English Slides and click on that.
There we go.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I believe you've probably already seen the learning objectives. And so we'll be talking basically about the unique experiences of violence as a result of colonialism experienced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples since first contact. A lot of my research is specifically focused on First Nations, but I'll make that distinction as we go along, looking at different research. We're also looking to understand the root causes of contemporary violence and other social and health issues within some Indigenous families and communities, and looking to recognize and understand the strengths of Indigenous peoples who have survived by actively engaging in colonial resistance and revival of traditional cultures across generations. And I just want to note that I will be speaking about, very traumatic experiences, and so please do put your well-being first. And if it's too distressing, please go take care of yourself, and you can come back if you're ready at another time. So just to briefly mention, Indigenous Peoples Canada are very diverse. We have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and even within those groups, within First Nations, we have over 600 communities representing over 50 nations and languages, all with their own unique histories and cultures. I don't have enough time to really give a kind of good overview of colonialism Canada. So I'll have to just very briefly describe that, it was really meant to get rid of the Indian problem that was once settlers arrived in Canada. And it involves a number of different traumatic events, include that a lot stemmed from the Indian Act, broken treaties, stolen land, forced relocations, and many more. Today, I'll be talking about policies that were aimed at assimilation that were specifically targeting children, specifically the Indian residential school system and the child welfare system, both during and after the 60s coup. So it was really in 1996 when kind of Canada became aware of the harms of colonialism and this huge impacts that it's had on Indigenous peoples through the release of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. And so this also revealed the importance of culture-based healing practices for Indigenous peoples. And it was concluded that tinkering with existing programs and services would not be enough to foster substantial improvements in the health of Indigenous peoples. And it called for new and innovative approaches to improve the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples and move towards reconciliation. But unfortunately, many of RCAP's recommendations were not implemented, and 25 years later, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report showing the same continued health and social gaps and intergenerational effects of colonialism, including not only health and social outcomes, not only health outcomes, but various social outcomes, including violent victimization and perpetration that's higher in some Indigenous communities, and that's higher among Indigenous peoples at the individual level when we look at as a population. And in the TRC calls to action, we see many of the same calls as we did in RCAP. So this is a quote from the TRC final report, which says that it became clear over the course of the Commission's work that most adult Canadians have been taught little or nothing about residential schools. And the poverty and social dysfunction in Aboriginal communities were emphasized without any historical context to help students understand how or why these conditions came about. This omission has left most Canadians with the view that Aboriginal peoples were and are to blame for the situations in which they find themselves, as though there were no external causes. Aboriginal peoples have therefore been characterized as a social and economic problem that must be solved. And so myself growing up, going to school in Canada, I actually didn't learn about residential schools until late in high school, and I didn't learn it at school. It was my mother who told me about it and told me that I should look into it and read about it. So, most people, adults today, didn't have the chance to learn about it, and hopefully that's changing, and kids are starting to learn about it in school. And so unfortunately, when the report's quote mentions these blaming attitudes, that seems to be one of the most common kind of negative attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. These kind of blaming attitudes that ignore the social context and the historical context of colonialism and its harms. This is just an example where our former Prime Minister was quoted as saying the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women is not a sociological phenomenon. But as pointed out in this article, dozens of federal, provincial, and community studies compiled by the Conservative government appear to contradict the Prime Minister's contention that the problem of missing and murdered Aboriginal women isn't a sociological phenomenon. And just, I'm actually not, my expertise is not really focused on violence specifically, but you can go to the literature and see and look at different models in predicting violence, and we see that we know that there's a number of different causes at the individual, family, relationship, community and societal level that all are predictive of violence perpetration and victimization. Just to give you another example, this is a systematic review that was done looking at predictors of domestic violence perpetration and victimization. And it identifies in adolescence, the risk factors, including having continued experiences of abuse, peer risk factors, substance abuse, and behavioral problems in adolescence. And going further back, childhood is risk factors are associated with violence in adulthood, which include child abuse, family of origin risks. So we're talking about intergenerational factors, behavioral problems, and socio-demographic risks. And for Indigenous peoples, layered upon all these potential risk factors, we know that a lot of these risks for violence are higher because of colonialism, both historical and ongoing aspects. And so that's what I'm going to be talking more about today, is that link. I will mention, although I'm not going to be focusing on this today, there are other factors outside of those that I'll be talking about that contribute to violence in Indigenous populations. For example, the work by Pamela Palmater and other Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars have pointed out that police involved racialized and sexualized abuse and violence against Indigenous peoples is one of the root causes of the large numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So, that's a whole other issue that I encourage you to explore and read about. But I'll be talking about the long-term and intergenerational effects of residential schools and day schools, and how that translated into continued intergenerational cycles perpetuated by the child welfare system. So just to give you some background, residential schools started in the early 1800s. Even before Canada was formed, there were mission schools that had been established in certain parts of communities for a long time. And they really sought to take the Indian out of the child. This is a quote from the Deputy Minister Scott, who was the person who really pushed for residential schools at the time. And he described that, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. This has been the whole purpose of Indian education and advancement since the earliest times. It is written in our law that the Indian was eventually to become enfranchised. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill." And that was to implement residential schools and to actually make them enforced by law in 1920, that Indigenous children, First Nations and Indigenous children had to attend. And just to also give a bit more history, there is, that kind of a common myth out there that, oh, well, Canada was trying their best to help Indigenous people. But just to point out one example of the huge neglect that was ongoing and that the government was well aware of. In 1907, Dr. Bryce, who was a government doctor, went to and visited 35 residential schools and described the unhealthy conditions and neglect. He reported malnutrition, overcrowding, poor ventilation, and unsanitary conditions that contributed to high instances of diseases. And he concluded that medical science knows just what to do and implored for the improved ventilation and to stop combining sick and healthy children because of the really high rates of tuberculosis that was affecting children. Just to very quickly give you an idea of how this led to huge inequities in death rates at the time for Indigenous children. This gives death rates from the 1900s from the 1920s until the 1960s. And you can see these huge disparities between the death rates in the general child population compared to Indigenous children who were attending residential school. And not only was there this huge neglect, physical neglect, neglect to take precautions around the spread of diseases, children at residential schools also experience widespread abuse. We know that thousands of children died, and they were also exposed to constant cultural denial and shaming. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But just to give you an idea, this graph is from a national representative sample of First Nations survivors who were living on reserve. And it shows, and it asks the proportion who reported being negatively affected by specific adversities at residential school. And so it's not reflecting exposure, it's reflecting if they think they were negatively affected by it. So it would be really underestimating the actual proportions who were exposed to these adversities. So up top, we see loss of language, loss of traditional spirituality, cultural identity, and we see between 67 to 75% of those who attended for 3 or more years reported harms associated with those experiences, and slightly less among those who attended for only 2 years or less. We see between 60 and 80% reported various types of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing abuse, emotional abuse. And then smaller proportions, about between 40 and 50 reporting harms associated with neglect, but that's probably, also had significant long-term effects as well, and maybe they're being underestimated. But in general, just to point out the very high proportions of children who went to residential school who were exposed to a variety of different childhood adversities. And we know from research in other populations that the more childhood adversities you're exposed to, the greater the risk for a variety of social and health outcomes, including risk for violence perpetration and victimization. This was kind of the original study that really looked at a huge, large sample of middle-class, middle-aged Americans, and asked about 10 different adverse childhood experiences. And just this kind of really revealed how prevalent adverse childhood experiences are in the general population, and since then research has shown how prevalent it is in a variety of diverse populations. And also the research in this study and since then has consistently shown how ACEs are associated. The more exposure, the more risk for various negative outcomes, including physical and mental health outcomes and various social behavioral outcomes. And as I mentioned again, that includes things like violence and related variables like delinquent behavior. And not only do we see these outcomes in adulthood, but we actually also see the effects of childhood adversity start to manifest immediately and within childhood, and that can continue their risk across the lifespan and potentially across generations. So we know that adverse childhood experiences are linked with depressed mood, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, aggression, violence, delinquency, and a range of comorbid illnesses. And another outcome is complex trauma, which kind of describes a range of outcomes associated with chronic exposure to trauma. That includes aggression, emotional regulation issues, problems with cognition, distress symptoms, and potentially dissociative symptoms. But I would like to point out and emphasize that although ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, are an important predictor of offending behaviors, it's really important to note that not all who encounter adversity engage in violent or criminal behavior, and many youth who are exposed to adversity also do not develop negative health and social outcomes. And this really points to the importance of other conditions, other factors at the societal level, at the family level, that can affect how youth react to ACEs and whether they can potentially be protected against these negative outcomes. Just to give you an example, this is a study that was done in a non-Indigenous population looking at the relationship between number of ACEs and predicted delinquent events in youth. And they also assessed the perceived collective efficacy, which really refers to the youth perceptions of how much they trust their neighbors and how much they feel that their neighbors would kind of try to keep a safe environment for the community. And we see that although there is this relationship between ACEs and delinquent events, those with high perceived collective efficacy are somewhat buffered against those negative effects. So they don't see the harms as much as those who reported low kind of neighborhood trust. And so this kind of leads me to talk about another study, a study that we did that was commissioned by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation I guess it was before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when during the independent assessment process, where survivors had to tell their stories of abuse in order to get compensated through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And more survivors were talking about abuse from other students at residential schools. And there were comments in the media being made that this wasn't anticipated, it was unexpected and bizarre. And so they wanted to kind of explore this issue more, to provide some explanations of why this would be so common. And so we just carried out a study where we conducted interviews with about 43 health service survivors who have worked with residential school survivors and in communities affected. And we looked at a number of questions, including the nature and prevalence of student abuse in residential schools, the factors that contributed to peer abuse, the effects on those abused, and those who perpetrated the abuse, and as well as the collective effects in communities. So I'll talk about all of these questions. And just to point out, the fact that people were surprised by this in those comments in the media, we in our literature, we kind of responded to that by actually showing that peer violence is very common across populations, and especially in residential care settings. We know that bullying and peer violence, as well as sexual abuse between peers, is very high, and from reviews that look at these contexts from around the world, showing that all of these factors that I'll talk about now really promote peer abuse among young people. So just to say, when we talk to these healthcare providers, they did say how common that physical and emotional abuse was talked about in the context of daily bullying, whereas sexual abuse was talked about less often, but was not uncommon. And so the first, to look at our first question, what are the contributing factors to student abuse? We looked at particular factors about the residential school context and how that contributed to peer violence. So first, residential schools really sought to isolate children from their normal socialization processes, where children were removed from their parents, their communities, and their cultural teachings, which from all of the writing I've seen of different First Nations, pretty much all of them describe violence not being common and child abuse not happening in traditional societies. Followed by this isolation, residential schools created a punitive and deprived living conditions for children, where they received arbitrary and unpredictable sexual, emotional, and physical abuse from staff. They were humiliated and shamed for their cultures, and they're shamed about their parents. And they were deprived of food, clothing, and basics, including healthcare and just various other types of adversities that we already saw. And so this was described as resulting in pervasive feelings of a lack of safety and powerlessness among students. Just to give you some quotes, one of the service providers shared when they saw staff physically abusing another student, at first they would tell other staff, but then nothing would happen. So they had no one to tell. So they would just stop trying to tell each other. They would go to the head of the school and they were told that they were lying and that it was not true and that the staff wouldn't do that. A lot of them were told that when they tried to tell somebody. So this was followed by a context in a residential school where aggression and abuse was actually fostered and encouraged. This occurred through explicit cultural shaming and racism aimed at kind of dissolving their valued and protective traditional identity that was taken away from them. And it was also described that there was a common division between perpetrators and victims, where a lot of the bullies would become tied to staff and supported by the staff and kind of their favorites. One person shared, because of the restrictive and abusive environments in schools, the kids often were forced to identify with their aggressors and displace and release their hurt and anger on younger and weaker peers. They would hit them or steal their stuff so they would feel like they were in control of something. In terms of fostering aggression and abuse, another factor that was contributed to this was, as noted earlier, the traumatic reactions to early life complex trauma, which involves acting out and potentially violence. This healthcare provider shared that young children who are processing a traumatic event, they process information by playing it out and reenacting it. So with young kids that are abused, the percentage of reenacting on other students is very high. Abuse was common in residential school, and I think it was typically traumatic reenactment. This is how children react to trauma. This is how they try to make sense of it. So of course, the prevalence is going to be high. Sexual abuse is not different than any other traumatic event, which is also reenacted. Another factor that contributed to aggression in residential schools was the modeling and the normalization of abuse by staff. One participant said being chronically abused at a young age tends to make people think that it's normal. I think of some men that simply thought, well, this is what you do with people. This effect is amplified when witnessing of student abuse was part of the normal childhood experience. Illustrating how chronic bullying that took place between students affected the perception of survivors, one counselor commented on how they were personally a little surprised that they were so nonchalant about the student abuse, even, they got knocked around a lot by older students. Another person shared some clients who were perpetrators both during and after residential school thought that being sexually abused, some felt it was normal. And another person shared that abuse was normal and clients felt that other students were doing what they did because it was sanctioned by staff, encouraged by staff, or learned by staff. And lastly, there were some who talked about incidents where perpetrators were explicitly encouraged to abuse other students by the staff. I'll just share one that the several shared stories about how staff gave the student abuser permission to handle or deal with the children in any way to maintain control over the student. Another described how some were given encouragement by staff to act as enforcers. This described both in relation to bullying as well as sexual abuse. For example, a counselor described how some kids were taught in residential school that in the absence of having loving and caring parents, you can substitute it for sexual things, and that this was condoned or even taught to them at school. And then step 4, after they come to residential school and experience all of this, they are then sent in step 4, sent back to their communities where where society maintains segregation and the marginalized status of Indigenous people. So after years of schooling, children would return back to their communities with neither traditional skills, identities, nor access to dominant group resources. Another very complicated factor is that victims and perpetrators of abuse were then sent back to the same communities, and often, very small communities often. And then the effects of trauma, there's pervasive trauma experienced by generations of children. And so this affects altered social norms, where abuse is just seen as part of life. So to kind of summarize that, we have this context where residential schools that occurred over generation is creating non-traditional identities and norms in which abuse is adaptive. Here we have pre-residential school violence and home linked with parental violence. So as this occurs over generations, children are even going to potentially be exposed to violence and other childhood adversities before going to residential school. And then we have generations of children going to school already with trauma, where they're cut off from family and deprived of basic necessities, which we know is protective. They have complex trauma reactions. Staff humiliates and demoralizes students, encourages abuse, and in this cycle continued over many decades. Another question that we wanted to look at was there any different impacts of student-to-student abuse on survivors compared to those who were just abused by staff? And one person shared that at the time it wasn't obvious, of course, but when I think back, there was an inability to trust anyone after that, the first student abuse experience. Even my own people. I remember as a child thinking I should feel safer with my own kind. I remember I felt more angry at the adults, the white men, but then also feeling, how can this happen from my own kind? More of a let down feeling. And then we also looked at what are the collective effects of communities of both staff abuse and peer abuse. And first I'll just talk about this one. And we, just as I was talking about in terms of trusting other people in your community, we found that a lot of the service providers talked about collective effects in relation to community relationships and lateral violence, which is a term that's kind of used to refer to kind of discrimination and bullying and various other negative behaviors with members of your own group. One person shared it was part of the systematic way that people in power used to teach us they were abusers, and they had to make sure we also knew how to be abusers, not only of other people, but to have hatred against ourselves. Bullying was only one form of it, and today we see this in First Nation schools. And then another collective effect, among others that I don't have time to talk about them all, but was silence regarding residential school experiences and the contemporary outcomes in terms of abuse and violence in some communities. They described just people not wanting to talk about it, and still within families and at the community level, which is, probably why myself and a lot of people whose families were affected described themselves not learning about it until they were adults. So just to give you another quote regarding this, a person shared, it has not been safe for people to make those kind of disclosures in their own families and communities for fear of being ostracized and being told that they're lying and to stop making trouble. But I would say this study was quite old now, done in 2000, about 10 years ago it was published, and this was during the independent assessment process. So we've since had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so I think more and more over time with all of these things that are happening, there has been a lot of movement in terms of communities and families and individuals talking about residential schools and how it has affected them, and that has led to healing. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, so I think at this point we see the trauma that was experienced in the residential schools, and not only do we see effects in survivors, but we also see effects in the children of survivors, which is what I'll be talking about a lot for the rest of the for the rest of the presentation. And this is a sample of First Nations adults living on reserve, and we see that those who enter residential school, about 56% reported moderate or high distress levels. But we see that the same proportion of those who had at least one parent and one grandparent who attended, so they didn't actually attend themselves, but they had a parent or grandparent to attend, they're reporting just as high levels of distress. And we see lower levels in the non-Indigenous population. And then this is the first, those with kind of somewhere in the middle is the First Nations population whose families were not directly affected. And so we see slightly higher, but not as high as those affected by residential schools. And that's because they're going to be also affected by these collective effects of not only residential schools, but other aspects of colonialism as well. This is just another example from a more recent national survey of First Nations living on reserve, looking at different substance use outcomes. And again, we see that those with a parent or grandparent who attended report higher levels. So we're seeing these intergenerational effects. This is an earlier study that our team did when we really wanted to start looking at what are the pathways involved in these intergenerational effects. And what we found was that adverse childhood experiences, not surprisingly, was a key factor in contributing to their higher levels of depressive symptoms. We know that survivors themselves experience childhood adversities, which is associated with a lot of risk factors that we would expect could affect parenting and their abilities to provide their children with, you know, an environment without these adversities. And not only do we find higher levels of adversities in the children of survivors in childhood, but we see that they also report higher levels of trauma in adulthood and higher levels of perceived discrimination or perceived racism in adulthood as well. And that all three of these factors that we looked at in this particular study contributed to their higher levels of depressive symptoms. In the same study, again, looking at, you know, what are these pathways that put the next generation at risk, we wanted to see if perhaps those affected were more vulnerable to the negative effects of stressors. And so here we looked at the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and depressive symptoms. And we found that those with a parent who went to residential school, this relationship was much stronger, but those who were not affected by residential school, so the dotted line, they weren't as negatively affected by childhood adversities. And we found the same relationship when we considered adult traumas and perceived discrimination in adulthood as well. And this is just an example of a study that was done in a Jewish population, where they compared those with a parent who was affected by the Holocaust and those who weren't, and also compared those who were diagnosed with cancer, which was viewed as a stressful experience. And similar to our findings, they found that those with that Holocaust background, so the green line, were more affected in terms of their depressive symptoms when they were diagnosed with cancer. Just skip that out of time. Another one of our findings that I think is important is this simple analysis we did comparing those First Nations living on reserve who did not have a parent or grandparent who attended and did not attend themselves. We compared those who had a parent or a grandparent and to those who had a parent and a grandparent, so 2 previous generations. And we found that those with those 2 previous generations were at the highest risk And we thought that this might suggest that the risk associated with residential schools might actually accumulate across generations, which is important when we think about the fact that they existed over for just over a century. We looked at the same analysis when we looked at suicide, attempted suicide, and suicidal thoughts. And again, we see this cumulative effect where those with 2 generations report the greatest risk, compared to those with 1 or 2 generations. So, a parent or grandparent who attended, and compared to those whose families were not affected at all. And this is just to, in case you're wondering about what proportion of the population, of the First Nations population, attended residential school. This is specifically looking at status Indian children, but starting in the mid 1800s and going as far as 1996. And you can see it's in the early 1900s when between about 60% or more were attending residential school. We see that increase when it became mandatory by law in 1920, more around between in the 70%. And then it was around 1950 when they decided maybe this isn't a good idea. And the proportion starts to decrease, but this took a long time for schools to close. In part because of the increase in Indigenous population and also because of the continued lobbying of the churches. And so the last residential school didn't actually close in 1996. So this graph keeps going, but the proportions are become lower over time. And then this is a graph representing the proportion of First Nations children, youth, and adults living on reserve across years who were either themselves attended residential school and or had a parent or grandparent attend. So they're either directly or intergenerationally affected. And we see that across years, since 2002 up until the most recent RHS, they're collecting data for the most recent one currently, I believe. But we see that about 75% of the First Nations population living on reserve was directly or intergenerationally affected. And I feel like that tends to surprise some people, as there's been some type of myth that it only affects a small proportion and it happened so long ago, but that's not the reality that we're living with. And this is just a slide to give you some examples of research in other populations, just to emphasize that these intergenerational cycles of risk and resilience is not just in Indigenous populations, and we see it across all populations. And when we look at populations who have specifically encountered collective trauma, like the Holocaust, like a Great Famine, in refugee populations, we see a lot of the similar outcomes with different flavors depending on the specific context. So as residential schools were closing down in the started closing down in the 1950s. That's when provincial child welfare services actually started beginning to give their services on reserve. And for a variety of reasons, including racism, including that communities were living with the effects of about a century of abuse at residential schools. So around this time is when they're suffering, that child welfare starts coming in with their own ideas about child rearing that differ from traditional ways. And we see a steady increase of the proportion of First Nations children who are taken into care. And so this graph shows, it's cut off for me at the bottom, but how it mostly peaks around in the 1960s. And so this is what we've referred to as the 60 scoop in Canada, where following residential schools, it was social workers that started removing children from their families and communities. And it was a report by Patrick Johnson in, I think, 1983, and I think he had some slightly earlier reports that talked about this, but he reported on how child apprehension had become the standard operating procedure for First Nations children, despite the fact that at the time it was accepted in the professional social work community that apprehension should be the last resort, and that Indigenous children were particularly vulnerable to the harms of removal. So they know how harmful it is to remove children, and that Indigenous children are even more harmed by this because of the huge cultural differences and their history of trauma. And it was in his 1983 report that he described how provincial child protection workers in BC used the term 60 scoop to refer to this increasing apprehension of Indigenous children. And he describes how this term came from his discussion with one social worker who admitted that they would, and this is the quote from the report, they would quite literally scoop children from reserves on the slightest pretext. And in this report, he quotes an earlier government report from 1996 that had looked at various at the situation on reserves, including child welfare system. And Johnson quoted that report by saying the child welfare situation for Native people, with some exceptions, could still be described as varying from unsatisfactory to appalling. And that's how it was described in that 1996 report, and it was no better after that time. And so this is just to give you a different time period here. It starts in the 1970s and ends later than before in the 2000s. And again, we see this is the proportion of the on-reserve First Nations children population. And here are the numbers of children in the blue line that are being taken into care. And so we see this growth here and the assumed peak of the 60 scoop in the 1970s, actually, even though it started in the 60s. And then we see numbers falling after First Nations communities started fighting back, and many started taking over their own child welfare services. And we see the numbers declining, but then we see them start to increase again in the 1990s after a certain funding, it's called Directive 21, was implemented, and it's just a funding structure that contributed to even more funding inequities for First Nations children on reserve. And again, we see the number of children in care and the number of, this is looking at the number of days in care, but we see that increase very quickly again. And again, just to point out that it was known at this time how harmful this was, of how harmful the extreme trauma of parental separation is. And this is from Timpson, who their report for RCAP that was talking about this issue. And they pointed out very clearly that the risk of damage by separation trauma through removal of children from their parents is viewed as more serious than most parental acts of omission or commission. So removal is worse than some of the neglect and abuse that they were facing. It was also pointed out that if children are being removed from very dangerous situations of abuse or neglect, resources should be diverted to programs for treatment and prevention of abuse and neglect. A lot of what we know now is that most of these cases from Indigenous communities were because of neglect, which was ultimately because of poverty, mental health issues, stemming from residential schools. And this report also pointed out if children are being removed inappropriately from parents, this must change whether the child is removed by a Native or non-Native agency or placed in a Native home or non-Native home. The emotional damage of separation could be as damaging as the conditions leading to the need for care. And so we recently just did a study to kind of not only look at consider the comparison of the trauma of separation versus the conditions in their home, but we also wanted to compare to, well, what are the experiences of Indigenous students that are being taken away? We would assume that they're being taken to safe places, but that's not what we find. We know that in non-Indigenous and Indigenous populations, children face high levels of adversities and trauma within the child welfare system. So we just recently did kind of a small survey with Indigenous peoples in Manitoba. So it's a small sample, but we asked them about experiences of childhood abuses, both within their biological families and also for those who were affected by the child welfare system in their adoptive home and or foster care and or group home. This is just one example looking at physical abuse, but we see that even when these children are being taken from their parents, they're still being exposed to significant trauma in their adoptive homes, in foster care, and group homes. And we also looked at this as a function of the year they were born to see if it was changing over time. And so we do see that for in some cases, it does seem to be getting better, but we still in 1991 or later, as an example, in foster care, Indigenous children, 87 experienced physical abuse in their foster care homes. So it doesn't seem that we're taking them to safe places. We also asked them about whether they experienced racism from a caregiver within the child welfare system. And again, we see these very high proportions of children reporting racism from their caregivers in adoptive homes and in foster care group homes. So unfortunately, today, we see these continuing huge inequities, disparities between Indigenous children within the foster care system. This is an old stat from 2016, but I know it hasn't changed much. But this statistic is that 7.7% of all children under 14 are Indigenous. And this is, and it's staggering when we look at the that it's about half, 52.2% of children in the foster care are under the age of 14 are Indigenous. So half in foster care and Indigenous, despite making up only 7.7% of the population. And this quote says that many experts have argued that the child welfare system, through its large-scale removal of Aboriginal children from their families, culture, and communities, be considered a continuation of the policies of forced assimilation of the residential school system. And so we wanted to look at this kind of statistically within our quantitative data. And we did find this relationship between those who had a family background of residential school and an increased risk of being affected by the child welfare system. Here we see that those who had a parent or grandparent were more likely to, about a third, just under a third, were reported having themselves been affected by the child welfare system. So here we wanted to look at how does exposure to childhood adversities influence this relationship between family background of residential schools and themselves being affected by the child welfare system. And we see that indeed that the cumulative exposure to ACEs contributed to this relationship statistically. And we know now that those affected by child welfare, they could have experienced adversities in their pre-child welfare experiences and while they're in child welfare as well. And not surprisingly, our analyses also showed that those with that personal history in the child welfare system is also associated with depressive symptoms. And this relationship held even when we were also controlling and taking account of their family history related to residential school. So both contributed to increased depressive symptoms. And this is just to point out that our research has focused on residential schools and the child welfare system, but there are many other harmful aspects of colonialism, including, for just another example, many communities were affected by relocation policies, forced sedentarization, where they forced nomadic groups to settle, which completely changed and affected these communities in negative ways. This is just one example of First Nations families of an Indigenous group in the US and Canada. And they found that those with a family history of being relocated was associated with issues in the grandparents, issues in the parents, and ultimately was associated with an increased risk for depressive symptoms and delinquency in youth. Just out of time, I'm going to skip through some of these slides, but they're just showing that national data today is showing higher levels of ACEs in Indigenous populations compared to non-Indigenous populations. But when we look over time, those differences do seem to be decreasing. So that's good and somewhat expected as we see time pass from the very high proportions of children who are in residential schools. And while the 60 scoop and child welfare system continues to perpetuate that, it is at a somewhat smaller scale in terms of proportions of the population. So this is just the same. So in talking about other potential pathways involved in intergenerational trauma associated with residential schools, so we've talked about diverse childhood experiences, but there's also various other social, psychological, and potential biological pathways that are involved as well. Research, we haven't looked at this in the context of residential schools, but research has shown that within Jewish samples, those who have a family history of the Holocaust show differences in terms of the functioning of their stress response system, which has been associated with their differences in mental health outcomes compared to those not affected by the Holocaust. And they've actually also shown differences in terms of epigenetic changes in the next generation. And just very quickly, to give a description of epigenetics, we know that a long time, 20 years ago, we know that we're born with our genes and we keep them, but over the past 15, 20 years or so, increasing research is showing how our environment can actually influence the expression of those genes by turning them on and off, so they're actually functioning different and expressing different. And so they found that in children of Holocaust survivors, they found some difference in terms of epigenetic factors compared to those who didn't have that family history. And again, I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides, but some of our research also looked at as a pathway by which trauma and resilience is transferred across generations. The quality of family communication in general, but also specifically about residential schools and specifically about cultural identity. And we found a number 7 themes specifically when we looked at this, and I'll just talk about a few. Many talked about how cultural disruption was one of the huge issues that contributed to their health and social issues. One person shared the loss of culture and language was by far the largest impact. English was the first language in our house growing up, and I was not even aware that I was Aboriginal until 10 years old or so. People also talked about cultural pride and how that was protective, and how their parents, either their parents instilled that in them, or they're making an effort to instill in their children. This person shared, I have made a concerted effort with my own children to reintroduce them to our language and culture and to instill pride in their Aboriginal roots. Similarly, another person shared, I was ashamed growing up, but I've since reclaimed my identity. Now that I'm on my own, I have more pride and I'm learning to love my identity. I gave my son a traditional Ojibwe name and I vow to raise him to be proud of who he is. And this is a graph just speaking to the importance of cultural engagement for First Nations peoples in general, but also specifically for those who have been affected by residential schools, and also likely the 60 scoop child welfare system, relocation, assimilation policies. But this is specifically looking at those who were not affected by residential schools or who were intergenerationally affected or who attended. And we're looking at the proportion who reported taking part in community or cultural events sometimes or always. And we see that those who were affected by residential schools, around between 60 and 80% are reporting that this is something that's really that they take part in sometimes or always, which this cultural engagement is really important for First Nations in general, and particularly in some cases for those who have been directly intergenerationally affected by assimilation policies. Not only are they engaging more, but our research and research of others has shown how various aspects of cultural engagement and identity are protective and promote positive health and well-being. In this example, we looked at the relationship between perceived discrimination and depressive symptoms. And we also asked them about different aspects of cultural identity. And in this graph, it says in-group affect. And all that really means is is a kind of fancy term for cultural identity. We ask people, how good do you feel about being a member of your group? Does it make you feel good? Are you proud of it? And we found that those who reported high levels did not see the same negative effects of those with low in-group affect in relation to how discrimination was related to depressive symptoms. So we see this really steep line among those with low cultural pride, but less of an effect among those who's reporting these high levels of cultural pride. Similarly, we found a similar relationship when we looked at the relationship between bullying and psychological distress. And in this case, we looked at a different aspect of identity where youth were asked if they have kind of weak feelings or strong feelings of belonging within their First Nations community. And we found that those with strong belonging, that seemed to buffer again against some of these negative effects of bullying in relation to their distress levels. And just to kind of mention how we're using this research and some of the work we're supporting First Nations communities is really to provide this kind of empirical evidence for First Nations communities, organizations to advocate for trauma-informed and culture-based approaches to health and wellness. There's not a lot of programming that provides funding for culture-based approaches, and our research and increasing work by others are showing how important this is for and foundational really to the health of First Nations and other Indigenous peoples. And I'm just coming to my last few slides here of also why we do this research and why we're keen to share and present and teach about the intergenerational effects is to hopefully reduce these kind of attitudes of blame towards Indigenous people and understand and really understand the root causes. And we hope that that is something that will then promote increased support and allyship among non-Indigenous peoples, and more healing and reduced lateral violence and more collective support within Indigenous peoples and within Indigenous communities. This was a report recently, I think that just shows the importance of us continuing to talk about this, continuing to learn about our history and recognize and acknowledge our history. Is reports of the increasing violence of denialism around residential schools. This is a report that came out last year reporting that a core group of Canadians continue to defend residential schools, denying either the abuse or denying or minimizing the destructive impacts. So this I kind of see as a collective gaslighting that is really harmful on top of everything else. So I think Indigenous peoples and particularly allies who may not have had the chance to learn about this, I really encourage you to learn more and to encourage other people to learn more, and in the face of denialism to speak up and speak the truth. And just to share this other quote from the same report, denialism is a uniquely non-Indigenous problem, and it therefore requires non-Indigenous people to actively work to counter denialism and to create and implement strategies to do so. And just to end off on a couple of inspirational quotes from some of my my heroes, really. Dr. Pam Palmater is quoted saying, "Following the lead of Black and Indigenous peoples, Canadians and Americans have the numbers, the wealth, and the power and the influence to force the radical change that is needed to end racism, violence, and injustice in government and society." And then Cindy Blackstock, who's another big hero who fought to, who really, along with the Assembly of First Nations, filed a human rights tribunal complaint against the government for, in addition to residential schools and causing all these harms, underfunding services over time. And once the child welfare system began, continuing to underfund services, continuing to neglect the needs of First Nations communities. And after years of the government trying to fight back in this human rights tribunal, they were successful in showing the racism towards First Nations. And so I encourage you to read up on that Human Rights Tribunal as well, and to gain inspiration from these great allies we've had in Canadian history as well. This is Dr. Bryce, and of course we know Gord from Tragically Hip. Also, residential schools and Indigenous peoples was an important in his life as well. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who did this research with me. It's certainly not me. Our organizations that we work with, the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, the First Nations Information Governance Center, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And I also, please, my email's here. Please, I encourage you to give any feedback. We're trying to improve our presentations to educate Canadians. So if you have any feedback, I'd be happy to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that incredible presentation. It was just full of so much rich information. And as you can see, there are many questions that have come in from participants, and so we're eager to get to them. I'm joined by my colleague, Katrina Scott, and so we'll take turns asking you questions. The first question, Amy, is around the specific experience of children kept in residential schools, and specifically, how long were they kept in schools? Was it for a specified amount of time? Oh, did we lose Amy?
Yeah, I think she's not in the room anymore.
Okay. I think maybe we'll just wait a few minutes. She might try to come back in.
She may, indeed.
The timing was great, though. It didn't happen during the presentation.
And I just want to reflect on some of the comments and how valued Amy's presentation was, and the research that she presented and the statistics that she presented. So hopefully she will have a chance to come back. You've got some excellent questions, as always.
Oh, there she is. Hi, Amy. You're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute. There we go.
Okay, I'm back. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what happened.
That's okay. We're just glad you're back. I'm not sure if you heard the first question, but I'll repeat it. The first question was, were children kept in the schools for a specified amount of time?
It varied across Canada and across time. And so some, people went for a few months, some people went for their whole childhood. I would say on average, it's going to differ in different regions. But a lot of most kids went for a good portion of, at least 3 years or a good portion of their childhood.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. The second question that we have for you has to do with siblings. So based on the research that you've done so far, do you think there's a possible connection between emotional abuse between siblings, so lateral violence in the sibling relationship, and those siblings who may be intergenerational survivors of residential schools?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that has happened and probably has its own unique outcomes, that are going to have different outcomes at the family level, in perhaps even, I think we know that sometime from the concept of what's it called, of betrayal trauma, that often when you're harmed by someone who you are otherwise expect to trust, the harms and the outcomes can be worse. So, we might expect some unique outcomes of that, but I'm not really sure of any research that has looked at it really.
Thanks so much.
The next question, Amy, is when exploring the pathways involved in intergenerational transmission of residential school experiences on depression and potentially antisocial behaviors, have you looked at potential protective factors?
Yeah, so maybe you asked that before I got to the end, but that was kind of, really what I focused on at the end of the presentation. And those are just, so a lot of our work has focused on culture-based protective factors, including cultural engagement and cultural pride. And so we do show those factors can be protective against family history of residential schools, and also ongoing stressors like discrimination or bullying. We show that these different aspects of cultural engagement is often protective.
Amy, I have a kind of challenging question for you, but I think one that will resonate with much of our audience. So knowing a little bit about lateral violence with and among communities and working to address that. So if you're a service provider, how can you work to address lateral violence in a way that respects sort of diverse cultural perspective and avoids perpetuating stereotypes and biases or blaming cultural community while still trying to effectively support individuals who are affected by this form of violence?
Yeah, that's a complicated, it's a tough one for sure, and complicated. I think, and are you talking like within Indigenous context specifically? Yeah. Yeah, I would say, not assuming that people have explored their own family history and their own collective histories because of the trauma. And we know that a lot of that has led to collective and family silence a lot of the times. And so I think, and part of our reasoning for, wanting to teach about this within Indigenous groups comes from, I didn't have time to talk about it today, but from historical trauma theory, from Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who's an American Indian psychologist. And so she kind of used teaching about a community's history and historical trauma while also emphasizing the strengths as an intervention, and that promoted a whole bunch of positive outcomes, including increased esteem in parenting, increased like healing within families, more cultural pride, all of these things that we know are good for well-being. And so I think, communities where there are different perspectives and maybe different religions and these different things, that we know that is from colonialism. And so, framing everybody as being affected collectively together, and acknowledging how complicated it is and teaching the history while also acknowledging, that just because certain religious groups did this, that doesn't mean those were people, those were violent people. And yes, the institution, these religious institutions had a lot to play, but that doesn't mean those people's spirituality doesn't help them, you know, and just kind of finding that collective shared identity, and instilling pride in their cultural identity, whatever way they express that. Sorry if it's a hard one.
Well, yeah, I know, and I really appreciate your reflections on bringing it back to what you found in terms of protective factors and involvement in culture. Yeah.
Amy, there's one question that's come in that's asked, is there data or research of any kind that shows specific child rearing techniques or child welfare techniques that Indigenous communities were using, which would cause social workers to remove children? Or were you saying that they would remove children without any precedence and to disrupt the family system?
I would say probably both. Like at the time when the 60 scoop started happening, like the communities were just totally already living with the effects of decades of residential schools. So poverty, mental health problems. And like I said, they were often removed from neglect. And so, the clear answer is support those communities and stop those inequities, and communities, and then combined with that, in coping with that issues, communities did rely on some of their more traditional approaches, where it's not just the nuclear family taking care of Indigenous children, it's the extended family, the community. And so that was oftentimes also like not understood at the time by social workers coming in, that, oh well, why is the children with the grandparents, and why isn't just questions with culture, because of cultural differences and not understanding. That was then also layered upon them not having really the accurate history and understanding of why why is there poverty here, why is there all these issues. That was not really known among social workers, and in fact they didn't even know that these huge disparities existed until like they kind of looked at data years later, and it was just happening, but it was the same thing was happening across Canada.
Yeah. So I have a question about whether or not you have any data or maybe even reflections on the experiences of queer and two-spirit individuals.
I would say, like, within my research focused on residential schools and child welfare system, I would just say that, well, I guess first off, colonialism, really interfered with traditional ways of viewing, two-spirited people, where there wasn't this inherent discrimination, and they were valued in communities. So that's kind of one aspect of how colonialism has affected. But also, with it then, because of colonialism and adopting, these negative views from the larger society towards two-spirited and LGBTQ plus, I think we know that they were also more likely to be victimized within the child welfare system today. And there are also additional risks that come along with that. So I think extra support and research focused on that particular population within Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and within the child welfare system is needed.
Thank you. The next question is, have you found any research or survivor instances of Indigenous people being very critical of other Indigenous people's identities? For example, one Indigenous person criticizing another, being very critical of how they choose to live, as they view that that person is not honoring their Indigenous identity and living like more of a colonial or Western lifestyle.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's a common part of lateral violence in Indigenous communities, questioning each other's identities, living on and off reserve. Do they speak their language or not? Do you look Indigenous? Do you not? All of these things is very sensitive. And again, framing it, I think trying to find a collective shared identity where we are not blaming each other, but we're blaming this larger thing called colonialism. I know it's hard to blame a system and a government and thing that happened over time, but understanding how that has come to be, and again recognizing the complexities of the situation of people, and trying to emphasize that shared identity and what parts of your cultural identity you can share and take pride in together, even if you might have some differences.
Amy, I'm going to ask a question that comes in a really verbatim way. It says, I'm a foster grandparent for one of my biological grandchildren. I must admit, I wish I knew then what I know now in terms of healthy traditional parenting and passing on the language to my own children. I'm teaching the language to my grandchildren, and now everyone has their spirit names. And so the question is there any research on the health and well-being of First Nation children that are in kinship care? And I think a similar question, any thoughts around whether or not there's any shifts since there's now Indigenous child welfare agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lovely thing to hear. That's really great. And absolutely, there is research showing the benefits of kinship care. And I could have gone on about some of the recommendations, but that has been the recommendation since the 1980s and 1990s, is kinship care as the best, the best approach. So I'm not sure. I could try to find some evidence. I haven't looked at that literature lately, but definitely we know that that's a good thing. And what was the other part of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, the other part of the question is having to do with Indigenous child welfare services. Do you think that these are contributing to change now?
I do. I think it's contributing to change, but it took a while because for a long time, even when it was transferred for a lot of communities, they were still being underfunded for years. And so even with no funding, appropriate funding, nobody can address the problem adequately. So since that Human Rights Tribunal that found the government of Canada guilty, has resulted relatively recently in the past couple of years of a larger amounts of, I think it was in the like $1 billion or something, a lot of money increasing going to communities, First Nations communities. And so, I think that's going to help. Is it enough? I don't know. We're not, again, we're not just talking about child welfare when we're talking about all of these issues are connected. There's other ongoing issues, that we didn't have time to talk about today. And so I think more of a coordinated, approach is needed, and that's really what communities have been calling for. And just really different, but like RCAP, in 1996 said we need really different approaches to really address these very complicated issues.
Amy, as a follow-up question, and I think you began to touch on it briefly, but how can child welfare policies and practices be reformed or approached alternatively to prioritize the safety and well-being of children while also centering and supporting families and addressing the historical and ongoing impacts of colonialism?
That's also like a big thing. And I would say, like, I am not the expert on that, but I mean, people have been suggesting changes, whose focus is on the child welfare system. They've been writing about it since the 1990s. And so I encourage you, to go to Cindy Blackstock's organization's website, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And they have, I think a lot of writing about that. And I think, again, it just, for a lot of it came down to, up until recently, the huge funding inequities that are just perpetuating these cycles. So hopefully that, I think this will help the more funding. But I think, again, kinship care, are there ways we can promote that? Are there ways we can that is kind of a little bit beyond me, but I'm also trying to learn about that and trying to contribute to finding ways.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Amy, there are some questions that have come in kind of around numbers, and they can be a little bit detailed. And I know that kind of going through all the numbers can be a bit complex. I think there's a couple I'll just ask about. So one person asked about the statistics around over 50% of children in foster care being Indigenous. Can you talk a little bit about that statistic? I think it's yeah.
Yeah, so just, and this is just the foster care population, so it doesn't include group homes and children who are adopted even, but just within the foster care system, yeah, it's Indigenous children make up 50%, despite only making up about 8% of the child population. And I think, yeah, people are just like, did you say that right? But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important and helpful to emphasize. And as we're talking about numbers, are there any other sort of statistics that you think are just really critical takeaways?
I think the one that surprised me when I ran the analyses was that 75% of the First Nations population on reserve has either directly or indirectly affected. I think that's huge. I think there's a big myth that, again, this happened so far in the past. It only happened to some, a small proportion, but it's actually the majority. And again, to emphasize that that's just residential schools. It's that large proportion is also layered with child welfare, relocation, all of these other things that also have contributed as well.
And I know some people asked about, okay, so if that's on reserve, and I know you didn't present data on the off reserve, but would you, and my guess is that it's harder to get that to have those statistics, but would you expect to be similar?
I do have those statistics, actually. I don't have the time to present them all, but generally, in terms of proportions, it's a bit lower, but not much lower for status First Nations living off reserve. It's only a little bit lower. For non-status, it's a bit lower. And then Inuit is kind of still pretty high at this point. And then Métis is a lower population, but it's still large proportions of the population. And we do see the same long-term outcomes when we're looking at outcomes of family history.
Amy, thank you so much. It's all the time that we have today. A few people had indicated that we could sit here for more hours together, but we do have to end the webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and to all participants for coming. Thank you to the French language interpreters, Caroline and Wendy, as well as the ASL interpreters, Anissa and Rogue. We just want to remind participants that once the webinar ends, an evaluation survey is going to open in the browser. And please complete this evaluation survey to receive a certificate of participation. Thank you so much, everyone, and take care.